Um, oh. I'm Cole Harrison, Executive Director of Mass Peace Action. Welcome back from breakout.
Hello.
I have the job now of introducing Representative Ted Lieu. Ted Lieu has represented California's 33rd Congressional District in the House since 2015. His district includes much of Los Angeles, Beverly Hills, Santa Monica, and neighboring areas. He served in the United States Air Force Judge Advocate General's Corps from 95 to 99. And since 2000, he has served in the Air Force Reserve, currently with the rank of Colonel. Ted Lieu was appointed Assistant Whip in 2017 and is co-chair of the House Democratic Policy Committee. Representative Ted Lieu.
Thank you so much, Cole, for inviting me to speak. And I want to thank Mass Peace Action and other groups that are putting on this wonderful conference. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about the legislation I'm doing with Senator Ed Markey to put restrictions on the ability of the president to launch a nuclear first strike, and then talk about activism and how we can raise awareness. The reason that we introduced this bill, by the way, had nothing to do with the former president. We actually first introduced this bill when Obama was president and when everyone in this room, including me, believed Hillary Clinton would be the next president. So it was never targeted at any specific individual in the president's office. It was really targeted at the structure of how we launch nuclear weapons. And as many of you know, all it takes to launch nuclear weapons is basically the president of the United States waking up one day going, you know what, I'm gonna launch some nuclear weapons. It is that easy. So essentially what happens is the president has sole authority. And so the president decides to launch nuclear weapons. And then that order gets passed down the military chain of command and missiles fly. There is no member of Congress in that chain of command, no member of the judiciary. There's not even any member of the president's cabinet that needs to be in that chain of command. So essentially there's virtually no check and balance. It's just the president of the United States. And in the view of Senator Markey and me, we believe that is flat out unconstitutional. If you look at the Constitution, the framers at the time went to great lengths to put a check on the president's power. They created an entire legislative branch to stop the president. They created an entire judicial branch to stop the president. And then they gave the greatest power they knew at that time, the power to declare war to Congress. So there's no way the framers would have allowed one person to launch thousands of nuclear weapons that can kill hundreds of millions of people in less than an hour and not have called that war. So our view is that when the president launches a nuclear weapon, that is a declaration of war, and the president cannot do that. Only Congress can do that. Our bill is quite simple. It basically says before the president can launch a first use of nuclear weapons, the president has to get authorization from Congress. So that's the gist of it. Now, having been in Congress now for 4 terms and interacting with 434 other members in the House of Representatives, we deal with a lot of issues. I can guarantee you that for most members of Congress, nuclear weapons is not in their list of top 20 issues. They just don't think about this. There's lots of other issues they've got to deal with. So if you can raise awareness and simply start educating members of Congress and their staff about nuclear weapons, how easy it is to actually launch them, that would go, I think, a great way in trying to get this bill through. In addition, I think Abraham Lincoln had it right when he said public sentiment is everything. With it, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. So I want all of you to understand your power to help shape public sentiment. All their activities that the groups are engaged in is extremely helpful. And then for individuals, right, think about social media. It's free. If you write an interesting post, maybe you'll affect someone in North Carolina or in Oregon or in California. Think about writing letters to the editor. It is true that many people do write letters to the editor. It's also true many of them come from the same people. So when you start writing in, eventually you're going to get published. Or think about writing an op-ed, and then you can start changing hearts and minds. And my view of politics is everything seems impossible until it happens. So if 10 years ago, I would have told you, hey, in 10 years, we're going to have gay marriage in 50 states, and in a number of them, we're going to be smoking weed. You would think I was crazy. But that happened. And it's because people kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And you never know when something flips in the public sentiment that causes a political issue to break through. And so I continue to urge all of you to keep on pushing this issue. I'm very honored to have your support in pushing this bill along. And I do believe that with enough public awareness, we can definitely make some changes in how nuclear weapons are acquired and launched. And if we can work together, I think we can go towards a more peaceful, stable world. So thank you so much for having me on, and look forward to continuing working with you.
Thank you, Congressman. Do you have time for 10 minutes or so questions?
Sure, absolutely.
Great. Let me lead off. And while I do, Brian, if you could comb the chat for other questions from attendees. My question is, where do we stand in Congress with regard to the Markey-Liu legislation, and what is it going to take to get a vote on it?
So why don't I take a step back and sort of explain some other reasons why we introduced the bill. So we would love for the bill to become law. But at the time, we also introduced it because Obama was, in fact, thinking about going, at least the public reporting was, he was thinking about going to a no first use policy, which some countries have. And we thought the bill might help him along. Unfortunately, he ultimately did not make that decision. And then we had the 4 years of insanity under Donald Trump. But now we have a perfectly rational president who, by the way, is doing great things for American people to take us out of this pandemic and move the economy along. But we want to see if we can get the administration to start taking steps to either go to no first use or to just put some more controls on nuclear weapons and the command and control and how they are launched. So that's another reason why we have this legislation. And then a second reason is we just want to make the constitutional argument very strongly so that if you're an officer in the military, you might just think twice when that order comes down and wonder, is this constitutional? Would the framers, in fact, have allowed me to do this? And so we just wanted to also put that in so that the Department of Defense officials might think about this much more and maybe put some more checks and balances in also their ability to have a nuclear weapon go off. And also for some of these high-level military generals to actually at least think twice about whether what they're doing is constitutional. If the president were able to were ever able to, do an order that says, let's launch all these nuclear weapons. Now, in terms of the actual legislation, unfortunately, one thing we have seen in the last 4 years is you had a number of moderate Republicans that I had worked with in the past, including on nuclear issues, and they're all gone. They either retired or they were taken out in their own primary. So now you have a smaller, more extreme Republican caucus. So it's been hard to get the same level of bipartisan support that we had 4 years ago, but we keep trying. And then in the meantime, we're going to be focusing on some of the more moderate Democrats to see if we can get them on board. So that's essentially the strategy.
Great. Elaine Scarry asks, why are you so alert to the unconstitutionality of sole authority and first use, and relatively few other representatives are? Is it your background in constitutional law and your service in the military that attunes you to these issues?
That's an interesting question. So because I served on active duty in the Air Force, which does have a lot of nuclear weapons, I was just very aware early on, even before politics, about nuclear weapons and basically how easy they are to launch. And that's always bothered me. But at the time I was in the Air Force, there wasn't much I could do about it. And then I was in local politics and in the state legislature where we don't have a lot of issues related to nuclear weapons. But then when I got to Congress, I remembered, hey, this is a problem. I'd like to start working on it. And so I was able to find a great partner in Senator Markey, and that's how we started to work on this legislation. And then in law school, having learned about the way the Constitution works, it was just very clear to me that the framers did go to great lengths to put checks and balances on the president, and they just never would have given one person this, as Secretary Perry has said, godlike power to basically destroy the world.
Gotcha. Thank you. Mike Van Elzecker asks, 5 months after Pearl Harbor, the US was making 1,500 tanks per month. 10 months after the SARS-CoV-2 outbreak, we still didn't have enough N95 for nurses, but we did spend $13.3 billion on new ICBMs. How do we get Congress to prioritize human health?
I don't disagree with anything in that question, and it sort of shows how upside down our world is. And who would have thought that last year, what Americans needed most in terms of protection weren't missiles or tanks or fighter jets, but actually masks and gowns and gloves and ventilators and other personal protective equipment. Now, just sort of a bit of a side, I think Congress is focused now on making sure we do have the domestic capability to produce PPE and to get that distributed instead of having to rely on other countries. At the same time, I think what the question is pointing to is we waste an awful lot of money on our nuclear assets. And I agree with that. And so I've supported legislation to try to reduce the amount of nuclear weapons that we have. We have way more than we need to destroy the world, multiple times over. And so we're just gonna keep pushing on trying to reduce the amount of money being spent on our nuclear weapons and launch systems, and to try to reduce their overall numbers as well. And again, I look forward to working with all of you to see if we can do some of that this term.
Great. And possibly the last question, I'm going to put Max Tegmark up. He's a professor of physics at MIT and president of the Future of Life Institute. Max, your question, try to make it brief so that Representative Lieu has time to answer it.
Great. Thank you so much for all the wonderful things that you're doing. It's an inspiration to have people like you in Washington. I want to ask you about artificial intelligence, which is what I mainly research at MIT. There has obviously been an increased discussion in using AI for all sorts of military purposes. And the most controversial ones that have been discussed have been lethal autonomous weapons, where the weapons themselves make the decisions who to kill. There was a United Nations report out last week where Turkish ones had been released on retreating people in Libya and killed a bunch of truck drivers just because the robots decided to. And I'm curious what your view is on this interplaying with nuclear weapons. In the past, when we almost had a nuclear war, there was a human in the loop. There was a Vasily Arkhipov to say "niet" out of gut instinct, or there was a Stanislav Petrov to say "niet" out of gut instinct. If we replace these people by an algorithm that just properly follows proper protocol, where does that leave us? And what are your views on keeping humans in charge?
Max, that's a great question. It's a very dark question, so I'm going to answer it. But before I do that, I just want to tell a little story. So I happen to be a computer science major. The reason I'm a computer science major is because physics was just too hard. I remember my first year in college, I took a physics exam and I scored, I think, like a 7 out of 100. And I thought, I can't do this. So I picked the one engineering major that didn't have a lot of physics, and that was computer science. So that's what I did. But in any event, you asked a great question about artificial intelligence. It would be horrendous to take the human out of the loop for two reasons. One is, with artificial intelligence, we ultimately, at the end of the day, don't quite actually know how machines think. So for example, right now we have deep learning, and machines are amazing, for example, at facial recognition and at teaching cars how to drive and so on. But when you sort of ask researchers, and I remember I had a lunch a few years ago with a professor at USC in facial recognition, he was telling me how computers could recognize faces better than humans can and so on. And I asked him, I said, well, how does this work? And he goes, at a very deep level, he says, we don't know, which I found quite disturbing. And basically, as you know, with deep learning, what happens is you feed a computer, a million pictures of cats. And then after a while, the computer figures out what's a cat and what's a dog and what's an elephant. but they don't know how the computer gets there from point A to point B. And that's what you'll never know with full-on artificial intelligence, with the deep learning kind, exactly how to arrive at that conclusion. You can guess. By the way, with the Artificial Intelligence Caucus in Congress, we're trying to come up with principles for transparency for artificial intelligence software to be transparent, to explain to folks what's happening. But it's very hard because with deep learning, you ultimately may never know or may not understand how a computer gets from point A to point B. And if that's the case, you can't give that artificial intelligence any access to nuclear weapons, right? Because one one miscalculation and the world blows up. The second is it decreases decision time, right? Computers think instantaneously, really quickly. And what you want to actually do in a military conflict or nuclear conflict many times is to increase the amount of time there is to make a life-altering decision. And computers could potentially take that away as well. There's been cases, as some of you may know in the past, where because there was some more time to make a decision, because they ran some double checking, they would eventually figure out that no, that was not a massive Russian missile attack on us. It was like the moon going over something, right? So it's something that's very disturbing if we stick artificial intelligence into nuclear weapons.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Lieu. I appreciate very much for joining us today and your leadership in sponsoring this bill, and the organizations that pulled this conference together are going to continue working together in a campaign for no first use, and we look forward to continuing to work with you on that.